Francis Bacon once said that a painting is an organism that changes under your hands. For him, the canvas was not a place to soothe or to flatter. It was a place to interrogate the body, to expose its fears and desires, to hold up a mirror that people would rather not look into. This is the story of a man who painted screams and left the world feeling both scandalized and strangely healed. He was born in Dublin in 1909 into a family that prized propriety. Francis Bacon's early years looked from the outside quite ordinary. A father who had served in the British Army, a household that expected respectability, but inside that house something fragile and combustible was growing. From a very young age, Bacon understood that he did not fit the mold his family had for him. His sexuality, his temperament, and his refusal to conform led to brutal punishments. Accounts from his childhood speak of humiliation and even physical violence, punishment for being effeminate in a world that equated masculinity with survival. At 16, he left home. He carried with him very little money and a stubborn refusal to adopt other people's rules. London, Berlin, Paris. These were the cities where he began to build a life out of fragments. He tried decorating and furniture design. He tried odd jobs that would keep him solvent. But the life he found most compelling was the one he would build on canvas. A turning point came in Paris in 1927. Seeing modern art, particularly Picasso, electrified him. He resolved quietly and with a stubbornness that would mark his life to become an artist. But his earliest attempts were messy, unsteady. He created pieces that critics would later call raw or unfinished. He was repeatedly rejected. Surrealists dismissed him as not surreal enough. Sales were scant. At one point, he destroyed many of his early paintings in despair. Yet out of that chaos came something powerful. By the early 1930s, he had produced work that hinted at his future obsessions. Crucifixions, distorted bodies, the collapsing of dignity into animalistic forms. These were not just images, they were wagers, tests to see whether painting could still say something meaningful about what it felt like to be alive. Then came 1944. In the middle of war and its aftershocks, Bacon painted 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. This triptych did not merely announce a talent, it detonated it. 3 figures, grotesque and wailing, occupy claustrophobic panels. The colors are acidic, the brushwork violent. Critics could not ignore it. The Tate acquired the work, and Bacon, who had no interest in polite conversation or small talk, became a central voice in post-war painting. What set Bacon apart was not only what he painted, but how he painted. He believed in immediacy and chance. He worked with photographs as starting points, images from Muybridge's motion studies, stills from films, portraits by old masters, but he transformed them violently. He smeared, blotted, dragged paint. He used the flatness of the canvas to create the illusion of disintegration, cheeks slipping like wet wax, mouths stretched into silent cries. His figures are never heroic. They are accidental survivors of their own bodies. The studio mattered. Bacon's working room was famously chaotic. Photographs pinned to walls, newspapers, cigarette butts, bottles, and broken chairs. He worked at odd hours. He kept a messy, improvised order that he trusted as a kind of engine for accident and invention. He liked objects around him that suggested violence or decay, animal carcasses, snapshots, magazine cuttings. All of these became ingredients. For Bacon, creation and destruction were inseparable. Bacon's technique defied neat description. He used wide brushes, rags, sometimes his hands. He would drag paint across a surface, lift it, punch into it, allow blots and streaks to remain. He embraced what he called the brutality of fact, the notion that art should not prettify, but should lay bare. The triptych format fascinated him because it allowed narrative fragmentation. A body could be seen across 3 moments, each panel an echo or a shock. He returned again and again to this structure, reminding viewers that identity and suffering are not linear. They arrive in shards. Few series embody Bacon's method more than his Pope paintings. Inspired by Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent VI, Bacon transformed the image into something animalistic and raw. The Pope, an icon of authority, control, and sanctity, becomes a figure of strangled distress. Mouths gape, robes smear into puddles of color, chairs become cages. What is remarkable is how Bacon uses art history itself as a resource. He did not copy. He charged ancient imagery with contemporary fear, fusing the sacred with the abject. The result was a scandal, political religious authority twisted into private terror. Bacon's subjects were often people close to him. Some of the most poignant paintings are portraits, not flattering likenesses, but exploratory dissections of friends and lovers. He painted Lucian Freud, a fellow artist, often in unguarded moments. He painted himself as an aging creature, and he painted the men he loved until their bodies were almost unrecognizable. If any relationship defined Bacon's later life, it was the one with George Dyer. Dyer was raw, an ex-convict from London's East End, tough and vulnerable in equal measure. Bacon was captivated. The two formed a volatile partnership of passion and dependency. Dyer became Bacon's model and in many ways his Achilles heel. Their relationship was intense and unequal. Bacon idolized Dyer. Dyer relied on Bacon. When, in October 1971, Dyer died of an overdose just before Bacon's major retrospective in Paris, the artist was plunged into a grief that altered his work forever. The Black Triptychs that followed stand among Bacon's greatest and most painful achievements. Painted in monochrome blacks and private obscured greys, they document the shock of loss, empty beds, obscured faces, chairs where a body should be. These paintings are not specific memoirs, they are universalized grief, yet their private charge is unmistakable. Bacon is painting the absence of the man who had been central to his life. Outside the studio, Bacon's life fed the myth. He was a fixture in Soho's Colony Room Club, the disreputable bar where artists, writers, and eccentrics gathered. There, he cultivated friendships and also wielded influence. He could be generous, buying bottles, ferrying money or food to friends. He could also be cruel, savage in conversation, impatient with weakness, brusque to those he considered insincere. The Colony Room was a crucible. It shaped conversations and reputations, lubricated careers, and also hardened Bacon's taste for provocation. He courted controversy in private as well as public. Bacon's sexual life, by his own account and that of close biographers, included masochistic practices. He confessed, bluntly, to seeking pain as an echo of earlier abuse. He sought humiliation and sometimes paid for it. These details have often been omitted or softened in polite biographies, but they matter. They are not lurid anecdotes. They are part of the psychological fabric that threads through his work. Bacon did not separate private life from art. He lived how he painted, messy, dangerous, and fearless. Bacon's professional life was complex. He courted dealers who wanted to sell his work to a growing market. He could be commercially successful, yet personally reckless with money. Gambling, spending on nights out, yet neglecting basics. His relationships with galleries were pragmatic. He needed money to live and to buy painting materials, and the art market supplied it, yet he kept his distances. Bacon treated the market like an unavoidable necessity, not a moral victory. His public recognition mounted through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Major exhibitions in London, New York, Paris, Venice, these shows proclaimed him an essential post-war voice. Critics both celebrated and reviled him. Some called him prophetic, a pitiless anatomist of the human condition. Others attacked the pornography of his images, the cruelty of his visions. But whether admired or despised, Bacon held the stage. Institutions collected him, museums sought his works, auction houses registered record prices. In death, the market insisted on his canonical status. Bacon's paintings drew eye-watering sums, and his place in art history seemed secure. Yet incoming adoration did not soften Bacon's edge. He remained defiantly uninterested in the moral lessons some critics tried to extract from his work. He insisted his paintings were not allegories in neat packages. They were attempts to render appearances, to show how bodies change under pressure, to reveal the physical fact of human life. This stubborn insistence on the materiality of suffering is what makes his paintings hard to dismiss. There are aspects of Bacon's story that are often left out of easy narratives. For one, his work was collaborative with photography and cinema. He was not a purist. He used film stills, found photographs and studies of motion to break the solidity of the painted figure. Muybridge's motion studies, for instance, provided ways to understand the body in motion, a skeleton of movement that Bacon could pull apart and rearrange. Film gave him the immediacy of a frozen scream, a posture caught halfway between endurance and collapse. These influences tie his painting to a larger 20th century visual culture, to cinema, and to the growing archive of photographs that changed how people saw the body. Technically, Bacon experimented constantly. He adapted and rejected methods as uses demanded. He often painted on unprimed canvas, allowing pigments to sink and feather in unexpected ways. He preferred to start with a flat background and then build forms that seemed to float within it. He used rags to smudge and compress painted surfaces. He sometimes wiped a wet canvas with a towel to leave a ghost of paint. He wanted to capture the traces of movement, of a hand moving across skin. That tactile quality, the smear of a finger, the chewy dragging of a brush, is a signature. Another often overlooked point is the careful use of space in Bacon's paintings. He intentionally framed bodies within emptiness. A figure might sit on an invisible chair, wrapped in a thin square or an implied rail. These isolating devices are not mere stylistic ornament. They are formal gestures that force viewers to confront the figure alone. By cropping or placing a subject in an indeterminate void, Bacon demanded attention. The viewer could not look away. Bacon's palette also evolved. Early works had darker, earthier tones, browns, ochres, midnight blacks. But as his career progressed, he introduced screaming pinks, violent oranges, razor-edged whites. He exploited color as emotional volume, a way of making pain either visible or unbearable. His use of high-contrast lighting, bright flesh against inky space, heightens the theatricality of his scenes. It's not melodrama for drama's sake, it's lighting engineered to isolate the body as a subject of study. Critics have argued about Bacon's sources. How much is Roman Catholic iconography? How much is modern cinema? How much is Nietzschean existential dread? The truth is, he borrowed freely. He looked at old master portraits, at medieval depictions of martyrdom, at film stills of agony. But he was not doctrinaire. He mixed influences until they became personal vocabulary, fetid, redolent, violent, and strangely tender. The scandals attached to Bacon's life are not incidental. They are part of how we read his paintings. He lived a life that refused gentle categorization, a homosexual man in an era of paranoia, a public figure complicated by private masochism, a celebrated artist who was also careless with money and sometimes callous in his treatment of others. He was accused by some contemporaries of cruelty, to friends, to lovers, to animals. He laughed at propriety and seemed to perform transgression as a badge of authenticity. There were also financial and legal troubles that have complicated Bacon's posthumous reputation. His accountant practices and deals with dealers drew scrutiny after his death. Offshore accounts and disagreements with galleries led to disputes and litigation. They are reminders that talent and morality do not always line up neatly, and that the business of art can be as ugly as the work itself. In Bacon's later years, something interesting happened. His work did not soften, but it became more condensed. The later paintings, from the 1980s until his death, often show a restrained palette and a focus on portraiture that is almost brittle in its clarity. He painted long series of the same subject with small variations, as if testing the limits of what a face can contain. There is less fury and more clinical observation, an artist who had exhausted some of his youthful rage and now probed the mechanisms of survival. He died in 1992 in Madrid at the age of 82. He left no public funeral, no grand statement. He had been a man of contradictions, generous and cruel, shy and flamboyant, atheist in a world thick with religious image. After his death, his studio, his messy cathedral, was rebuilt as a museum exhibit. Viewers can now step into his world, the photographs pinned to the wall, the bottles, the cords, the paint-stained floor. It's less an arrangement than an archaeological site of someone who believed deeply in the physical traces of life. His influence stretched beyond painting. Filmmakers have borrowed Bacon's visual grammar, the cropped frame, the violent smear, to articulate psychological crisis. Writers and poets have used his images to describe modern loneliness. Philosophers have turned to his work when discussing embodiment and mortality. Pop culture has not been immune. The visceral dramatization of identity crises in music videos and fashion owes something to Bacon's formal language. He became, for better or worse, shorthand for a certain kind of modern anguish. Yet for all the homage, there remain debates. Was Bacon a moralist, a nihilist, a man who glorified suffering? Critics answer differently. Some say his paintings are evidence that he embraced the worst in humanity. Others insist he was a compassionate witness, exposing suffering so it could be understood. Both can be true. To view Bacon's work only as an endorsement of violence is to miss its central ethical dimension. His paintings force viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about the body, desire, and the inevitability of aging and death. There are lesser-known scenes in Bacon's biography that deserve attention. For instance, his early embrace and later destruction of many youthful paintings. He burned or otherwise destroyed work he thought sentimental or false. This ritual of annihilation is telling. Bacon did not want to be boxed in by his past. He preferred to dismantle it himself, to remake his identity through destruction and invention. Another overlooked truth is Bacon's complicated relationship with younger artists. He was both a mentor and a tormentor. He encouraged some, broke others down, and sometimes used young men as models in ways that today would be considered exploitative. His legal guardian of legacy, a longtime companion who inherited the estate, found himself in litigation over Bacon's financial practices and the distribution of his art. These dramas, played out after Bacon's death, reveal how legacy and law collide at the intersection of genius and imperfection. Let's return to the paintings themselves. Stand in front of a Bacon canvas, and you will notice the surface work even before the image resolves. Paint sits like coagulated memory, thick in some places, almost erased in others. You see fingerprints of the maker, the bruised texture of pigment, the sex of an artist who liked to work by hand. Bacon's surfaces are topographies of emotion, ridged, torn, scoured, and they ask us to read them as records of labor, not mere illustration. Consider how Bacon handled faces. He rarely offered a full, finished portrait. Instead, he provided glimpses, a cheekbone, the shadow of an eye, a mouth pulled into a crescent. These fragments are like notes scratched into the margins of an otherwise disordered life. They function as hints. We may never see the whole person, but we can infer suffering, desire, vanity, and mortality from the traces left behind. His triptychs are perhaps his most theatrical achievement. Place 3 panels side by side and you have a stage. Bacon used that staging to compress time and to create psychological cross-currents between panels. An action that begins in one panel might collapse into silence in the next. The effect is cinematic, snapshots stitched into a short film of human collapse or endurance. Think of it as a condensed narrative operating outside of narrative's usual comforts. There are also real human costs in Bacon's life that simple romanticization cannot cover. The men who tried to love him often paid dearly. George Dyer's tragic end is central, but he was not the only one to be hurt. Bacon's insistence on living as he wanted, in public and private, sometimes meant crossing boundaries and leaving damage behind. A candid look at Bacon includes both admiration for his vision and a refusal to excuse the harm he caused. But even when we criticize, we must remember, Bacon's risk was also his gift. He refused to make tidy pictures or easy consolations. He trusted that art could be abrasive and that truth might arrive as discomfort. That uncompromising stance is why his paintings still feel urgent. They do not soothe, they demand. What should a young artist learn from Bacon? First, the courage to pursue a language that is unmistakably yours. He did not imitate fashions, he absorbed influences and turned them into a personal grammar. Second, the willingness to recognize that life and art are not separable. For Bacon, the studio was not a protected bubble, it was a place to test one's limits. Third, the double-edged lesson. Genius does not absolve you from ethical responsibility. Talent and cruelty can coexist, and we must hold both in tension. Francis Bacon left behind a body of work that refuses to be comfortable. He left canvases that are at once appalling and irresistible. He left a life that was both generous and brutal. The story of Bacon is not a tidy narrative arc of redemption or decline. It is a lived proof that art can expose the human condition in its cruelest honesty, and in doing so, can make us see ourselves more clearly. To stand before one of his triptychs is to be confronted by a question. Can art teach us to look at the parts of ourselves we prefer to hide? Francis Bacon's answer was a thunderous yes. He painted the scream so that we might hear who we are. And for that, despite the ugliness and the scandals, we remain in the room listening.